Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 12. Living Things and Their Habitats. The morning passed off without incident. Sophie was moved back to her original seat at the back of Yasmin and the absent Clara. Kingsley appeared at school just before break time and told Mrs. Phoenix that he'd gotten up late. She went easy on him with it being his second day, and Ryan Myers had taken yet another day off, much to the annoyance of Mrs. Tabard and her dinner money debt collecting. Sophie briefly worried about Desmeralda getting to the classroom to confront her again, but then soon realised that there was no way any creature, mythical or not, that would get past the scariest thing in Pinkleton Primary, Mrs. Tabard. The feeling of excitement that started the day had all but faded from Sophie and Yasmin as they realised that zoning into school was pretty similar to just being at school normally. It had been a fun, necessary experiment, but actually it was a bit of an anticlimax. Dinner time then came and went as uneventfully as the morning. Sophie and Yasmin saw no point in eating and so sat on the playground hypothesising about how they might get Miss Sissons to sit down with Desmeralda without her spiriting her away as soon as look at her. They came up with nothing. The afternoon began as it always did, with registration and a maths arithmetic challenge. Sophie flew through it and Yasmin was close behind her. They both scored full marks and the spelling test mishap from the day before yesterday was forgotten. After that, Mrs. Phoenix explained that they would be going out onto the now tidy field to finish their topic on living things and their habitats. Sophie remembered telling her dad the topic that they were doing, and he said he remembered doing that when he was at school, but when he had done it, it had been all about the mythical creatures that generation shared the planet with. He had studied centaurs and kraken, while Sophie was left with just the average things that could now be found on the school grounds. Although she had again asked Mrs. Phoenix if she could recap some of the creatures from years ago. Mrs. Phoenix had once more refused and told Sophie she was being silly for even asking. Mrs. Phoenix outlined the task, which, as it was the last week before half-term, was merely to finish off what they had started earlier on in the week. Sophie and Yasmin pointed out to Mrs. Phoenix that they had finished what they needed to do, and so she assigned them the job of helping Kingsley out, as he would have no idea what to do. "I trust I can get you to work together without fighting and arguing breaking out?" she asked Sophie and Kingsley, rather patronisingly. "Of course, miss," Sophie chirped back. "Kingsley?" Mrs. Phoenix asked. Kingsley didn't answer. He just nodded, picked up his book, and made his way onto the field with Sophie and Yasmin. The girls made their way towards their favourite spot, the willow tree. They sat down underneath it, and Kingsley parked himself next to them. There was an awkward silence for a few seconds before Yasmin, very unsubtly, asked, "So what's the deal with these powers of yours?" "What powers?" Kingsley replied, sarcastically, but the sarcasm went miles over Yasmin's head. Yasmin looked at him like he was being ridiculous. "Oh, come on. We're two of the three that have seen you use them. Don't try and deny them." Sophie hit Yasmin on the arm to try and get her to stop quizzing him, but, after a moment's contemplation, Kingsley assured her it was okay. As far as he was now concerned, his secret was out with these two, and it felt quite liberating being able to share the powers with people, and the bond that he'd built with Sophie yesterday lunchtime put him at ease even more. He had looked for possible friends like these all his life, and he wasn't going to mess it up now. "The blue electricity, or gas, or whatever it is, started when my mum came back," Kingsley said. Sophie and Yasmin sat forward in interest. They had battled a dragon yesterday and were now talking with a changeling who was almost completely new to his powers. Sophie was living every second of it. "When she came back, the feelings started to travel through my body. While she was away, I just heard her voice, and I couldn't understand what she was saying. Then, when she came to me, it all clicked," Kingsley elaborated. "What did?" Yasmin asked. "Everything became clear," he replied. "I could concentrate on things, see things, and sense them. I can channel my energy into living things and do things to them." "Like making the dragon disappear?" Sophie asked. "That was the biggest thing I've ever done," Kingsley said proudly. "I'd only ever done insects or people trying to hurt me before." "Why were people trying to hurt you?" Yasmin asked, knowing what the answer already was, but wondering if Kingsley knew. Kingsley thought for a moment and took a deep breath. Like the woman with the dragon, they try to take my mum and me away, and I have to stop them. They've come for you before? Yasmin asked. Sophie sat back slightly at this point, as she and Kingsley had had this conversation yesterday, but Sophie decided Yasmin needed to hear it from him, not her. Yeah, Mum doesn't seem to know who they are, but they keep shouting hybrid at her and something about needing her to get home, but I don't let them take her. Yasmin thought for a minute. Has your mum ever used her powers? She asked, deliberately not telling Kingsley that she knew about the pensioners from yesterday. Yeah, but she isn't in control of them like I am. They seem to control her rather than the other way around. I can pick and choose, except for the voices. She turns angry, and afterwards, the powers come out, then she can't remember much of what's happened. Sophie surmised that this was because the changeling side of Desmeralda was fighting its way to the fore, gradually taking over her. On the other hand, Kingsley might be exaggerating how good he was and how bad his mum was to impress his new friends. The changelings must have been taking advantage of situations where Desmeralda was emotional to take over her, like when she first looked upon Kingsley, or when she'd gotten upset at Sophie yesterday. Although Sophie did wonder why the changelings had left when they saw Desmeralda and not tried to capture her then. I have to look after her, Kingsley concluded. You said you could look after us. Sophie nodded. But we need to learn more about your powers first, because we know a woman that can help. But if your mum's powers take over her, then she will just lose control and spirit her away to the underworld, as you did the dragon. Can you show us anything else? Sophie asked, quickly changing the subject. The blue glow inside Kingsley appeared again, but this time just at his fingertips. He looked at the grass under the willow tree. An ant was scurrying across one of the blades. Aiming his index finger towards it, a short blast of the energy came out and trapped the ant in a much tinier blue sphere than the one that entombed the dragon. Kingsley raised his hand, and the ant lifted slowly off the ground. Sophie and Yasmin watched in fascination. Kingsley looked back at the ant, and it suddenly grew to the size of his arm. Yasmin started to scream before getting her hand over her mouth to stop it from coming out and alerting someone. As soon as the noise came out, though, Kingsley shrunk the ant back down. Mrs. Phoenix looked towards them as she looked at everyone out on the grass studying various creepy crawlies they were finding, but didn't take much notice. Whoa, Yasmin said when she'd calmed down. The ant was still floating in the air, but at its normal size again. What else? Sophie asked, more intrigued than ever. Loads, Kingsley replied. I can change the age of things, make them younger or older, shrink them, change their colours, the sending away power. We're calling it spiriting away. That sounds better, Yasmin interjected, and Kingsley continued. It's the one I can do best, though. The others I'm still practising. Sophie thought very carefully about what she was going to say next, as she didn't want to offend Kingsley, but she just had to ask. You said the voices disappeared from inside your head, but yet yesterday, when you got me into trouble, you had your hands over your ears like you were trying to block something out. Why were you doing that? Sophie was quite proud of how tactfully she'd managed to put it. That was the powers taking over Mum when I'm not with her. She talks to me and tries to make me do things. He'd gone right back into his shell again like he looked when he first came to the classroom. She still talks to me sometimes when I'm at school and tries to get me to do things. She wanted me to ask you where your old teacher was, but I wouldn't do it, Kingsley continued. Why not? Sophie asked. Because I don't know what she does or where she is when I'm not there. It's as if she's turned into a different person. I hate it. It wasn't very nice for me, Sophie replied, only half joking. Is there anything else you can tell us about her? For the first time since they'd sat under the tree, Kingsley looked at Sophie with an air of suspicion. All his life he'd had people trying to look after him, and none had succeeded. He had assumed these girls were different, but if they kept questioning him like this, he might just think they were out for their benefit and not his. Perhaps they were trying to use him for something they wanted. He had no idea what to think. Why? He asked. Sophie realised what was going on and was honest with him, which Kingsley appreciated greatly. Because we want to help with the voices, and we seem to be immune to your power, try and use the blue energy on me or Yasmin. Kingsley looked at her more baffled than anything this time. Go on, Sophie said. Are you sure? He asked. I must have just missed you last time. Kingsley, though, quickly surmised that if the girls really could help him, then he wouldn't hurt them by using his powers on them now, or if there was a mistake and he did end up spiriting them away, as they called it, he would be no worse off than he was before. Meanwhile, Sophie wondered for a split second whether Kingsley may have missed or whether her memory was playing tricks. If he had missed, this could be a very bad idea. "Try it," she said, one last time, assuring herself that it would all be fine. Kingsley straight away called up the energy and aimed it at Sophie. The blue blast flew out of his hand, but, thankfully for Sophie, went straight through her. Kingsley looked extremely confused. "I've never had that happen before. What are you?" he asked. "We're both special like you," Yasmin replied. "So is Clara." "We can help," Sophie added. "Just give us the chance to. Tell your mum we would love to help her, but we have to be careful. Make her angry or emotional, and we can't do anything for her." Kingsley looked so pleased. All his life he had been an outcast, a loner, the weird kid who always got into trouble. Now he had two people who were practically begging to help him, and for the first time he could hear their voices. They weren't being drowned out by his mum's efforts to talk to him. "What do you want me to say to her?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Sophie replied. "We need a plan to keep everybody safe first. One thing you could find out is why exactly does she need to talk to Miss Sissons, and what does she plan on doing to her once she meets her?" Kingsley nodded in agreement, and the three went back to playing about with his power. Sophie had finally found something new and exciting to do after 6 weeks of absolutely nothing. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.